Now, I really want to clarify a couple of things for the exam, the certification exam. In our concept of developing a computerized, personalized report, the first thing we do is identify the primary behavior. Primary is furthest from the midline or the energy line, quite often referred to. Our graphs are based on a 100-point scale. So 0 at the bottom, 100 at the top, 50 is our midline. And so we can measure the intensity of each of these factors, and we go from the midline up and the midline down. What is furthest from the midline, we're going to call that the primary behavior that is driving your bus. The next thing I want to look at is what is the secondary behavior, okay? The secondary behavior is that other factor that is furthest from, or next furthest from the line, whether it be up or down. So we're going to determine a primary and secondary behavior. Sometimes we talk about a core behavior, and then we're only talking about one of the factors above the line, D, I, S, or a C. When I'm training salespeople or managers or team building or anything, I only train people about how to interact with a high D, high I, high S, or a high C. Now you got to realize that the person I'm talking to is one of those four factors. It's either their primary or their secondary. So I only really have to show them how to interact and work with three other styles. If I was trying to train on how to interact with a high D, interact with a low D, sell to a high I, sell to a low I, high S, low S, you see how I would complicate it. So we can refer to it as the core. We're just going to teach you on how to interact, and the secondary is going to be a part of that, because we don't have a lot of those me conflicts that I'll talk about in a little bit to have two factors that actually fight. And then sometimes we have a pure factor. A pure factor is when the midline and you only have 1 point above it. Could be a D, I, S, or a C. And my research indicates that less than 1% of our population of high Ds only have the D above the line. Less than 1% the I above the line. Less than 1% have the S above the line all by itself. And only the C, same thing, less than 1%. You know, and yet I will see things in the marketplace where people are talking about these four graphs as they're all over the place. They're not. People are a mixture of these styles, and it's this integration, the blending of these styles, that really makes us unique and actually makes us more than one-dimensional. So those are important things, and I covered that for the exam because on the exam, you'll be asked certain questions to help you identify those, and I hope this helps you. And here's 3 examples to help you understand what I just talked about. You can see by looking at the examples, and we've identified both the primary and the secondary for you, and you can look at how far they are away from the midline and draw that conclusion. Again, this is very important information that we feed into the computer to generate your personalized report. As we go through the chapter on reading graphs, you'll see we're having images of relationships. We've got descriptors, and we also have verbiage. What we're attempting to do is give you some ideas on how to talk about these factors. Back when I first got involved with the assessments before they were computerized, they were manually scored. And so we would go into an office with somebody and making a sales call, and we would want to demonstrate the power of what we do. And we would have them respond on the spot. I would score it, and I would immediately start talking to them about themselves. In fact, one of the assessments I used had feedback on it, but I used to tear off the feedback section so that I was the only source. When people liked what they heard from me, they had to follow me home because I was the only way they could get information. And so I learned a long time ago that if you really want to demonstrate the power of what you do from a coaching or a training or consulting or selection standpoint, you have to be able to demonstrate this. And while we use the computer reports today to sort of cover us, let me tell you, reading the graphs is really where it's at. Reading these graphs is so critical because you're not always going to have time to read the report. You need to be able to look at a graph. By looking at a graph, you're going to know what's in the report by understanding Chapter 5. And it always amazes me when I'm debriefing somebody and I'm just using the graph. they'll say, hey, wow, my report said the same thing. I'm thinking, whoa, that was good. I've got a good memory in that case. So this is why we actually want you to really learn how to read graphs, because I still have my phone ring and somebody will give me a graph and I say, okay, give me the D. Where is it on a scale of 1 to 100? Okay, I can draw an image of that graph. Now tell me what job they're in or what you're looking to do or what the conflict is, and I can start talking. When you show me conflict between two people, I can be anywhere in the world on my cell phone. You give me both of those graphs and I immediately will identify why they're having conflict. I can identify the good points on each side, and I can help you build them into a couple that really wants to go to lunch together, just by spending a few minutes understanding that they both are unique, they both are normal, and they need to learn to love their differences. So I want you to really pay attention to Chapter 5. I like to have people run graphs or run reports on their relatives. Keep the report so that the relative does not have it, and go over, sit down with them, take the report with you, and start talking to them, or maybe give them the report and then start talking to them. But where you really make money in this world is when you know something about somebody that you really should not know. When I say you know something about somebody, you could go to a high C farmer and say, wow, I'll bet you buy from people that live over here. Make those statements because you can predict. I remember quite a few times that my phone would ring and I'd say, Bill, I've got this graph. He's a sales manager. He's a high S, high C, and I expected him to be a high I, and I just don't know what to do. I have one comment that I make 100% of the time. Trust the graph. Trust the report. Go talk to them. There's a lot of high S's and high C's that are in those types of jobs. Let me tell you, there's certain jobs. We proved at IBM that a high C was better at selling $1 million computer than a D or an I. The D's and the I's were never around long enough for that sales cycle, which was quite long years ago. So understanding all of these things through the graph reading really allows you to sort of skip over reading every sentence in a report, because you're going to know the gist of that report because it's based on the concept of our graph reading. 30-some years ago, I started teaching people how to read graphs. And part of my process was to talk about a point spread. In other words, these two factors, the primary and the secondary, or any of the factors, the further they're apart, the more truthful I am in talking about that factor. In other words, anytime they're over 20 points apart, we're really talking about something that's true, and if they're 70 points apart, we're darn true. If we're talking a little bit in the middle, hey, this is a tendency, and if the point spread is from 0 to 9, less than 10, we could be blowing smoke if we were really telling you how we would interact that together. To give you an example of what I'm talking about, let's say that the person's D is at 90, okay, so it's 40 points above the midline. Let's say that the I factor is at 85. Is this person going to be a D or an I, or how are they going to interact? They're going to be a D, and they're going to mask a lot of that competitiveness, that aggressiveness of a D in friendly terms, because the I is there with it. Let's take that I factor and lower that I factor all the way down to, I'm going to make it at a 15 on the bottom, so that the D is the primary and the I is the secondary. Hey, now you got a D that believes you want to hear the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, no matter how ugly it is. Okay? Low trust coming with that. It's sort of trust but verify type of information. But my point is that it makes a different person. And measuring those intensities, high D, extremely low I, I'm telling you, you need to be prepared, because they're going to throw questions at you, they're going to search for information, and they're going to demand that you not give them things like, trust me. Trust me is not going to work with any low I, especially if they have the C with that. So again, we'll continue on here to talk about, but point spreads, as you study Chapter 5, which is in the Universal Language Book, to understand more about graph reading, is important to build into your strategy, because when you pick points that are further apart and you start debriefing a person about their graph, you're going to be right on with that. As you start debriefing and the points are fairly close together and you're trying to draw a connection with that, it's a weak tendency, and so don't overplay your hand on those type of point spreads. All right, let's look at reading this graph. We can see that the I and the S are furthest from the midline. So there we have our primary and our secondary. So if I'm going to read this graph back to you, I could talk 4 or 5 major points about high I's. You're optimistic, you're outgoing, you like to be around people, you're persuasive, you love having fun, you're just the life of the party. And you also have a lot of contacts because you're involved in a lot of different activities, and activities that involve people, you're going to make a lot of contacts. You're going to have a lot of friends. You're going to make friends very easily. You're going to know a lot of different people. So I can connect those two things together. I also see the relationship between the I and the C. You're going to be seen as a little bit independent. You're going to mask that independence in those friendly terms that the I come out. You're not going to necessarily follow rules and regulations set by other people, but you're certainly going to be somewhat aware and sensitive to rules and regulations. And you're not going to get angry quick, and you're not going to really like, competition, or confrontation maybe would be a better thing. You could deal with it, but it's not your favorite thing. And when you get into a situation where there's confrontation, you try to be the negotiator and make things go away, make people happy, and bring that together. That's one of your great strengths. So it gives you an idea here as we go into our graph reading process. Now let's go on and look at other graphs so that we can get a better grasp of this, because this is one of the major things that you need to know to be able to deal on the spot with anybody by just looking at their graph and looking at the environment they're in and start talking to them about themselves and their relationship with other people. Okay, let's look at this graph. We see the I is the highest, so we're going to talk about the I first, and then we're going to talk about the relationship of the I and the S, the I and the C, the I and the D. Now we've got to look at the D and the S, the D and the C, and then the C and the S. So you can go to chapter 5 and collect information that would allow you to talk about those people. But the real key is that we're at TTI, we're living in the background. The computer doesn't have a clue as to whether you're a male or a female or what job you're in. So you can really illuminate this in their minds by knowing the job they're in and talking to them. I mentioned male and female. Actually, in our reports, the text to talk about males and females is identical. The only thing we change is the he or the she, okay? It's the exact same text, and I'm very proud of that because we treat all people as equal. I got to share with you, 30 years ago when I started training people on DISC, I allowed them to use a cheat sheet, and I actually put together a small paper where they could actually look at what's in Chapter 5 and use that to read, and I'm going to encourage you to do the same thing I did with them. Because you don't learn this by just listening to me talk about it. You actually learn this by practicing and doing it with other people. So I'm acquainting you with it, and I'm just giving you the highlights on a little bit of the D and then just the opening pages of the I, S, and C to give you a glimpse at what is available for you when you're ready to study and to practice this with friends and relatives. I'm not going into a lot of detail on this slide, but I'm showing it to you because I want you to be aware that it is available. It's in the Universal Language Book, and it really gives you an overview of the D factor in a little bit more detail than what I've covered so far. And it also talks about limitations. For the first time, it's coming up with talking about a D. So please refer to Chapter 5 and study this, and study about D, I, S, and C people. And here's the first page on Ds. Now let's look at information on the I. Okay, let's look at information on the S. And now let's look at information on the C. Now that we have a little basic understanding of DISC, I want to make you aware of some common characteristics between some of the dimensions. For example, D's and C's have several things in common. One is they both like to control. Now, let's look at why they control. The C will control because we're going to do it the way we should do it, the way the policy calls for, the way the instructions are. The D will control because I'm in charge here and we're going to do it my way. So if you're just looking at control, does a person control? You can't identify whether you're really reading a D or a C. They're also precise about the use of their time. So it's very important if you're calling upon a C or a D, you show up exactly on time. The C is actually prepared work right up to the minute that you're coming. And he does not want to be interrupted early or late. The D, the same thing, does not want to be interrupted early or late, but is precise about the use of their time for different reasons. When I call on a high D and he asks me if I want a cup of coffee or something like that, I say only if you do, because I don't want to interrupt the quality time I'm going to have with that person. I'm going to get in there, I'm going to start with business, and then finish with business and let them know that what I'm there for. Common between the D and the I, they're both fast acting, they're both high risk, and if we're only looking at whether they're risk takers or not, you can't tell whether a D or an I. The D, remember, is quick to anger. The I is very emotional. The I will talk a little bit more with its hands. I'm going to give you some tips and clues on how to identify the difference between a D and an I. Remember, the D is quick to anger, and the I talks with their hands. They lose a lot of emotion, and so that'll give you a little idea on how to read whether you're looking at a D or an I or a combination of the two. Also, now when we look at the I and the S, we see that both of them are imprecise about the use of their time, and they're warm and close, which is neat things when you look at, but you got to understand, are they quick to change or slow to change? And are they very emotional or unemotional? That will help you determine whether you're looking at an I or an S. Now, as we look at common things between the C and the S, we'll find that they're both slow to act, low risk, and they will ask questions to sort of discover more information before they make those decisions. So this is just some tips to give you some ideas when you start out reading people that you don't misread, that you're looking for the small nuances to help you understand who you're really talking to, a D, I, S, or a C. Also, we need to visit about some unusual graphs. Anytime we have all 4 points above the midline, we have an unusual graph. This happens a little less than 1% of the time, but what we have here is a person who is attempting to be an overachiever, or they feel their job requires them to be all things to all people. Sort of like a safety director of a plant. You got to be in charge, you got to be nice to people, you got to follow up and follow through, you got to do it right, and you got to do it with a very little budget. So think about that. When I see this happening in graph 1, it could be temporary. Let's say you just started a new job. You really don't know that job yet, so you're going to have to learn what the environment is calling for, and so you may attempt to be an overachiever. If it shows up on graph 2, you should be concerned. What we really have here is a person who's into burnout, trying to be an overachiever, and it's the real them. And I sometimes will have a person respond to the assessment again. Let's go back in your life when things were really going well for you. You were on top of it. I want you to think of who were your friends. Tell me where you were and this and that. Get back in that environment and then respond again, staying in that focus. A lot of times this will actually come out with the real you. And then you and I can visit about the real you. The real you's still in there. You just happen to lost sight. And this happens to people in life where they go sort of through a search. Who am I? What am I going to be when I grow up? So it's not a problem unless we don't address it. Then it becomes a real problem in graph 2 because it can lead to total stress and burnout. Also, let's look at a tight pattern. A tight pattern is when we're between 45 and 55 on the graph. Everything is just above or just below. It's very tight. Man, it's hard to tell anything about that person because we're trying to interpret, and remember our point spread? There is no point spread. So be able to generate a report. Now, by the way, we do generate a report on that person, do the best job we can with it, but you need to know that that report may not be totally accurate. But again, I have them reflect back on a time when things were going well. A lot of times we'll see that graph sort of spread out and that they need to understand that and spread that out. But when you get a tight pattern like that, you're basically countering. Every time you say, I'm most like this, the next time you're saying, I'm least like that. So you're countering yourself, and there's some people that just don't understand that much about themselves, or they're going through some turmoil and they're not able to really read and interpret much about themselves. So this can be a great process to help them discover that, because I'll tell you, when you either have an overshift or a tight pattern, you're concerned, but you do not know how to articulate this information to other people.